The morning Sarah Milton woke up that Saturday in June, the sun was already hot and determined. She'd planned the day meticulously, a quiet coffee on the patio, some weeding in her garden beds, maybe finally opening that book her sister had recommended 3 months ago. The kind of Saturday that justified 5 days of relentless work as a database administrator, quiet, controlled, entirely her own. At 34, Sarah had spent the last 7 years rebuilding her life after her divorce. The backyard was her sanctuary. She designed the pool herself, working with contractors to create an oasis. Natural stone pavers, strategically placed palmettos for privacy, underwater lighting that turned the water sapphire blue at dusk. It had cost her nearly $60,000, funded by careful budgeting and years of overtime. Every inch of it was hers. She was standing in her kitchen in bare feet, watching the coffee brew in the French press, when she first heard the music. It was coming from the direction of her neighbor's property. Marcus and Diane Chen lived 2 houses down. The music was loud, bass-heavy, the kind of thing that belonged in a club, not a residential neighborhood at 10 a.m. Sarah frowned. She didn't remember them mentioning a party. Not that they were obligated to tell her, but the Chens were usually considerate. They'd brought her casserole when her dad had his surgery. When their dog got loose and ended up in her yard, they'd been mortified. The music got louder. Sarah poured her coffee and went to the window. She could see their place through the trees, gates open, cars parked haphazardly along the street. She counted at least 7 vehicles, and it was still only mid-morning. Apparently the Chens were hosting something. Fine. She closed the window and settled into her usual spot on the patio with her coffee and book. By 10:30, the bass had evolved into something more complex. Music mixed with voices, laughter, the sound of beer bottles clinking. Sarah was still on page 2 of her book. She tried to read. The words weren't sticking. She was hyper-aware of every sound drifting over from the Chen property, and aware, too, of the growing irritation in her chest. At 11:00, she heard what sounded like a fence post cracking. Sarah's head snapped up. The fence between her property and the Chens was ancient, a 6-foot wooden thing that had been there since before she'd bought the house. Her property line, her privacy barrier. She stood listening. Another crack. Then voices shouting something, and then a sound like something large and wooden hitting the ground. She walked toward the back of her property, coffee forgotten on the patio table. The afternoon was already hot, the sun beating down on her shoulders as she reached the fence line. The wooden panels between her and the Chen property had always been slightly warped from weather and age. Now, as she rounded the corner, she saw that the entire northwest section had collapsed inward. And pouring through the gap were people, dozens of them. For a moment, Sarah simply stood there, processing. Teenagers in swimwear, college-age kids, people her parents' age, couples, groups of friends, all of them streaming through the destroyed fence section toward her yard like a tide. Some carried towels, some carried coolers. One kid, he couldn't have been more than 17, was carrying an inflatable raft. "Excuse me," Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Excuse me." A woman in her 60s turned at the sound. She was wearing a cover-up and flip-flops, and her face was flushed with sun and margaritas. "Is this where you live?" Sarah asked, though the answer was obvious. "Honey, we got over 100 people at the Chen house, and the pool is tiny. Marcus said we could use the backyard next door. He said it was fine." The woman was already turning away, moving toward the pool. "Beautiful place you've got here. That water looks amazing." Sarah felt something in her chest tighten. "Wait, you said he said he didn't ask me anything." But the woman was already gone, kicking off her flip-flops and walking toward the deep end. It was like watching a single drop of water create a crack in a dam. Once the first person had crossed into her yard, the others seemed to follow with accelerating momentum. Groups separated from the main stream now, exploring, checking out her garden beds, examining her furniture, treating her backyard like a public municipal facility rather than a private home. Sarah started walking toward the fence breach. She needed to get to the Chen house. She needed to talk to Marcus directly because surely this was a misunderstanding. Surely he hadn't simply decided to allow strangers to use her property without asking her permission first. She was halfway through the fence gap when she literally collided with Marcus Chen himself. He was holding a beer in each hand, and his smile was the kind that suggested he'd already had several more. He was 63, normally a mild-mannered investment advisor with thinning hair and a tendency to overthink even simple decisions. Right now, he looked like a man in the grip of something manic. "Sarah, hey, come on down to the party, man. We've got a ton of people. Diane's cousins from Sacramento are visiting, and they wanted to throw a thing, and I mentioned. He gestured vaguely toward her property with a beer-holding hand. I mentioned we could use the space next door. You mentioned? Sarah's voice was steady, but she could feel her hands shaking. Marcus, you don't have permission to invite people onto my property. You don't have permission to demolish my fence. And you definitely don't have permission to let strangers use my pool. Oh, come on, Marcus said, and his tone shifted, became less collegial and more dismissive. What's the big deal? It's just a pool, it's just water. Those words, just water, struck Sarah as profoundly wrong. This wasn't just water. This was 7 years of rebuilding. This was summer nights with friends, reading by the underwater lights, the way the pool made her backyard feel like a resort rather than a suburban patch of grass. This was hers. The big deal is that you're currently hosting a party on my property without my permission, Sarah said slowly. And I'm asking you to tell your guests to leave, all of them, and I'm asking you to restore the fence to its original condition. Marcus's face shifted. The forced friendliness drained away, replaced by something harder. You know what, Sarah? This is a family situation. This is a family reunion, and which makes it exactly none of my business, and even more of a reason that you shouldn't have just assumed you could use my space. And I think it's kind of sad that someone has this beautiful pool and property, and they won't even share it with people who are just trying to have a nice day. He was speaking more slowly now, enunciating as though he thought she might have trouble understanding. We're not harming anything. We're just having some fun. They're in my pool right now. And that's a problem, how? Sarah felt something cold settle into her stomach. This was not going to resolve itself with conversation. She could see it in the way Marcus was standing, the slight wobble that suggested he'd been drinking steadily since morning, the set of his jaw that said he'd already decided her objections were unreasonable. I want everyone off my property in 10 minutes, Sarah said, or I'm calling the police to have them removed for trespassing. Jesus, Sarah, really? We're neighbors. 10 minutes, Marcus. She turned and walked back through the fence gap into her own yard. Behind her, she could hear Marcus muttering something about people being uptight, about how this was exactly the kind of thing that was wrong with neighborhoods these days. Everyone just looking out for themselves, no sense of community. Sarah stood on her patio, hands on her hips, and watched the chaos unfold in front of her. The pool was full, absolutely packed with people. There had to be 30, maybe 40 bodies in and around the water. A girl who looked about 19 was lying in her pool floaty, completely oblivious or completely uncaring that she was trespassing on private property. 3 men stood at the edge of the deep end, having what appeared to be a serious conversation. A child who couldn't have been more than 5 was being dangled toward the water by a shirtless man in board shorts. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed. The dispatch operator on the non-emergency line was not particularly sympathetic to her situation. There had been a break-in at a commercial property on the other side of town, and the closest available officer wouldn't be able to respond for at least 40 minutes. Did Sarah feel like she was in immediate danger? No. Then did she want to file a report about trespassing or? Sarah hung up. 40 minutes. The party would have moved into full gear by then. There might be even more people. The situation might spiral beyond even her ability to control it. She stood at the edge of her patio and made a decision. Excuse me, she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. She had to do it 3 times before she had enough attention. A few people turned curious. Others continued what they were doing. Everyone, I need you to clear this property. You're trespassing. You need to leave, now. An older man, maybe 70s, squinted at her. You own this place. I do. Well, that's rude, the man said, and went back to floating on his raft. The disconnect was staggering. It was as though Sarah had just suggested something deeply offensive, as though she was the unreasonable one for objecting to dozens of strangers using her pool without permission. Sarah felt something crystallize inside her, a cold clarity about what she would need to do. She went inside her house and found the utility closet. The pool system was complex. She'd spent time learning how it worked because understanding her own property was important to her. The main shutoff valve for the water line was here, behind boxes of old Christmas decorations and cans of paint. She stared at it for a moment. No, that wasn't the answer. Draining the pool would destroy it, would damage the equipment, would ultimately only punish herself. She went back outside. More people had arrived. There had to be 50 now, maybe more. The parking situation on the street had devolved into chaos. The music from the Chen house was somehow even louder. And standing at the edge of her pool, holding court like he owned the place, was a man in his 40s with an expensive watch and an utter absence of shame. Sarah walked toward him. Up close, she could see he was organizing something. He had a clipboard, and he was assigning people to tasks. Organizing the party, maybe, or a group activity. "Can I help you?" he said, noticing her approach. "You can help me by getting off my property," Sarah said. "Who are you?" "I'm Brandon. I'm Diane's nephew. I'm helping coordinate." "I don't care. You need to leave, all of you. The police are on their way." It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that had power. Brandon's face didn't change. "Lady, your neighbor Marcus invited us to use this space, so unless he's going to come out here and ask us to leave." "I'm the property owner." "Yeah, and he's your neighbor, so you should have worked that out with him before making a fuss." Sarah turned away. She couldn't make them leave. She didn't have the legal authority to physically remove anyone, and the police weren't coming for 40 minutes at least. She needed a different approach. She needed something that would make the space itself inhospitable. She went back inside, her mind working through the logistics. The pool needed to drain. Not through the main shutoff, that would ruin the equipment. But what about the secondary systems, the filter circulation, No, wait, there was something simpler. The backyard had an outdoor shower, a rainfall fixture that she'd installed last summer because she loved the feeling of rinsing off after swimming. The shower had its own water line that fed from the main house supply. It had always had good pressure. She'd had the contractor install high-end fixtures. The water that ran from that shower was exactly as clean and forceful as any garden hose would be. Sarah was moving toward the bathroom window, already visualizing it when she stopped. What was she thinking? She was standing in her own kitchen, imagining opening fire with a shower on dozens of people in her pool, and something about that thought carried a weight that made her pause. Not because she wouldn't be justified, she absolutely would be. Not because it was illegal, it was, or at least it was reckless and could be construed as assault. But because the moment she did it, she would lose the moral high ground entirely. She would be the crazy neighbor with the hose. And somehow, looking at it from that angle, that seemed like exactly what Marcus and Brandon and all of these people wanted her to become. They wanted to make this her fault. They wanted to tell the story later. She was so uptight, so hostile, she actually attacked us with water, and have everyone nod sympathetically about how unreasonable she'd been. Sarah made a cup of tea instead. She sat on her patio in clear view of everyone in her pool, and she called her lawyer. Gerald picked up on the second ring. He was her divorce attorney, and though the divorce was finalized, he'd maintained contact with his clients. That was the kind of service he provided. Ongoing relationship, ongoing protection. "Gerald, I have a situation," Sarah said and explained it. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. When she finished, there was a pause. "How many people are we talking?" "At least 50, maybe more. They keep arriving." "And Marcus Chen is your neighbor. He destroyed the fence." "Apparently his nephew-in-law organized this as a family reunion. Marcus just gave permission to use my yard because the Chen's property is too small. He said," Sarah's voice cracked slightly, "he said it was just water, that I should share." "Okay," Gerald said. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to contact the police and file a formal trespassing complaint. Even though they might not respond immediately, the complaint will create a paper trail. Second, I'm going to send you a cease and desist letter template that you can print out and post on your property, ideally somewhere visible to all these people. It won't have immediate legal weight, but it serves as documentation that you warned them. Third, and I want you to listen to me carefully on this, you're going to document everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. If anyone damages your property or equipment, you need evidence." "What do I do if they won't leave?" Sarah asked. "You call the police back and tell them the situation has escalated. You tell them people are refusing to leave private property even after being warned. At that point, the police have more authority to intervene. In the meantime, you remain calm and do not engage in any physical confrontation or assault, no matter how frustrated you feel. You understand me?" "Yeah," Sarah said, "I understand." She hung up and started making a list. Cease and desist letter. Gerald was emailing her the template in 5 minutes. Phone call back to the police. She'd do that immediately, reporting the breach and asking them to add another unit to the dispatch queue. Photos and video, she had her phone, and she had a small Sony camera somewhere in the bedroom. But as she was gathering her phone and camera, she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was glass breaking. Sarah ran through the house and burst out onto the patio. For a moment, she couldn't identify what had happened. Then she saw it. One of her large planters, a beautiful glazed ceramic piece she'd special ordered from a local potter, worth about $200, lay in pieces on the ground. A teenager was standing near it, looking sheepish, holding a beach ball. "Sorry," he called out. "Accident." An accident? He'd broken something expensive, something irreplaceable in its specificity, and called it an accident. Sarah felt something inside her shift into a different gear. She didn't call the police again. She didn't print the cease and desist letter. Instead, she went into the kitchen, pulled off her t-shirt and shorts, changed into her swimsuit, and walked out to the pool. The crowd parted slightly, confused at her presence. She walked to the outdoor shower, a pristine white rainfall fixture mounted on the side of the house. She turned the knob. The first few seconds were confusion. People spluttered, twisted away from the spray, cursed under their breath. A woman in a red bikini threw her hands up and shrieked. One man actually fell backward into the pool, the water from the shower mixing with the pool water in a surreal collision of private boundaries. "What the hell are you doing?" Brandon shouted, running toward her. "Stop that." "This is private property," Sarah said, and her voice was eerily calm. "You have 5 minutes to leave before I open up the main water line to the pool and drain it completely. You do not want to be here when that happens." She wasn't actually sure that draining the pool would happen the way she described. The logistics were fuzzy in her head, but Brandon didn't know that. Brandon only knew that he was being drenched by water from an outdoor shower, and that the woman holding the nozzle was speaking in the kind of measured tone that suggested she was absolutely willing to follow through on whatever she said. "Are you insane?" Brandon sputtered. "Am I insane, or did you show up at a stranger's house and decide you had the right to use her personal property without asking?" Sarah didn't lower the shower nozzle. "You're trespassing, you're vandals, you're disrespectful, and you need to leave." The water pressure was intense. She was hitting the water hard enough that it was creating a haze of spray in the heat. People were scrambling toward the fence, the broken fence section where they'd entered. Some were grabbing towels. Some were just leaving, dripping wet, moving with the urgency of people who'd suddenly realized they were in a situation they didn't understand. A woman around Sarah's age made eye contact with her, and in that moment, something almost respectful seemed to pass between them. This woman understood what Sarah was doing. This woman recognized that there were boundaries, and those boundaries had been crossed, and consequences were appropriate. "Come on, Brandon," the woman said, picking up her phone and keys. "We're leaving." But Brandon started. "We're leaving now." It was like watching a flock of birds startle into the air all at once. The party that had felt so established, so immovable in its occupation of her space, suddenly became a fluid thing, people moving with purpose, gathering their belongings, exiting through the fence gap. Sarah kept the water running. She stood there in her swimsuit, one hand on her hip, the other gripping the shower nozzle with the posture of someone who would never lower it. The message was clear. There was a boundary here now, and it was being enforced. Marcus appeared in the gap in the fence, his face dark with something that wasn't quite anger, but was in the same family of emotions. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I asked people to leave my property," Sarah said, "since you didn't have the authority to tell them to do so. I live here, this is my neighborhood. You don't live here, you live 2 houses down, and your lack of respect for property boundaries is not my problem to solve. You know what? I'm calling the police. I'm telling them you attacked people with water." "Please do," Sarah said. "Tell them exactly what happened. Tell them you demolished my fence without asking permission, allowed dozens of strangers onto my property without my consent, and when I asked you to manage the situation you created, you refused. Tell them all of that." "You're crazy." "I'm done." Sarah turned the shower off. The action felt dramatic in a way she didn't particularly like, but she was committed to the performance now. She was committed to being the kind of woman who turned the water off when she was finished teaching a lesson. The backyard looked like a small natural disaster in the aftermath. Wet towels lay abandoned on the pavers. Solo cups were scattered around the pool deck. The water itself was murky from the number of people who'd been in it, dark with sunscreen and sweat. Several of her potted plants had been knocked over. The ceramic planter she'd seen broken was still in pieces. No one had bothered to pick it up. Sarah stood there, dripping wet, and felt the full weight of what was going to come next. She was not wrong in what she'd done. She was not unreasonable in her response. But she was also now the neighbor who had attacked people at a party with a shower. By the end of the day, the story would have transformed in the retelling. She would be the unreasonable one. She would be the uptight, hostile woman who hadn't understood that it was just a family reunion, just a bit of fun. The sun was still high and hot. It was only around 1 p.m. The day was less than half over. Sarah went inside and called her sister. Michelle answered on the second ring. She was always available for Sarah, had been especially so since the divorce. They were 2 years apart, Michelle the older one, the one with the husband and the job in marketing and the 2 kids in a good school. They didn't have a lot in common on the surface, but they had the kind of bond that survived difference. "Are you okay?" Michelle asked immediately. Something in Sarah's voice must have signaled urgency. Sarah told her the whole story, all of it. The party, the fence, the rejection of every reasonable boundary, the final moment with the shower. Michelle was quiet for a long time after Sarah finished. "You did what?" Michelle asked finally. "I opened the shower and—" "I heard you. I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. You attacked your neighbors with a shower hose." "It's a rainfall shower fixture mounted on the side of my house, and I didn't attack them so much as I made them uncomfortable enough to leave." "Sarah, that's—" Michelle stopped. She was working through something. Sarah could almost hear her sorting through the implications. "I mean, I get why you did it, but do you understand what's going to happen now?" "What?" "I don't know exactly, but something. People like that don't just let this go. Marcus is humiliated. His family reunion is destroyed. Someone, probably multiple someones, has to explain to their social circles why they left a pool party drenched and furious. That's not something people let lie." "So what do you think I should do?" Sarah asked. "I think you should document everything. Take photos of the fence damage, the broken planter, everything. I think you should call the police and make a formal complaint. And I think you should hire someone to fix the fence before Marcus can claim you're deliberately vandalizing his side of the property line. He demolished it without permission." "Yes, and those are fight-now conversations. But if he comes home and sees his fence in pieces and you haven't done anything about it, he's going to position it as your fault. He's going to say you destroyed his property in retaliation or something. You need to get ahead of this." Sarah knew her sister was right. This wasn't over. This was the moment right after the action before consequence. This was the pause between cause and effect. She got dressed and spent the next hour documenting. Photos of the fence damage from multiple angles. Photos of the broken planter. Photos of the scuffed pavers where something heavy had been dragged. Photos of her pool, dark and murky from the afternoon invasion. She called the police back and filed a formal report for trespassing and property damage. The dispatcher was more sympathetic this time. Maybe because there was now a formal record, or maybe just because it was easier to respond to documentation than to a voice on the phone saying she'd turned a hose on people. An officer did eventually show up around 3 p.m. He was young, maybe mid-20s, and he seemed mostly interested in confirming that no one had gotten hurt. Sarah showed him the photos on her phone. She showed him the broken fence, the damaged planter, the disturbed landscape. The officer made some notes and said that the property damage could be a civil matter and that if Marcus wanted to press charges about the shower incident, that would be his right, though she had the right to defend her property. It was all very ambiguous and unsatisfying. By the time the officer left, it was approaching 5 p.m. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, and the neighborhood had regained something like its normal quiet. Sarah sat on her patio with a glass of wine and tried to process the day. The water in the pool was still murky. She would need to run the filter system for several hours, maybe even do a partial drain and refill. The fence would need to be replaced, and she'd have to eat the cost because Marcus would never voluntarily pay for it. The planter was gone. Her sense of safety in her own space was compromised. She could see now that private property meant less to some people than she'd believed, that boundaries were negotiable, that her right to her own space could simply be overridden by a neighbor's desire for convenience. She was so focused on these thoughts that she almost didn't notice when a car pulled into the Chen driveway 2 houses down. It was Marcus and Diane returning home. They must have gone out at some point while the party was happening, or they'd fled to avoid the confrontation. Sarah watched, not quite hiding but not quite in plain sight, as they parked and got out. She expected Marcus to storm over, ready for a fight. Instead, he and Diane stood in their driveway, apparently surveying the damage. The fallen fence section would be visible from their property. They were speaking to each other in what looked like urgent tones. After a few minutes, Marcus went inside the house. Diane remained in the driveway, phone to her ear. She was calling someone, her parents, maybe, or a lawyer, or the police to lodge a counter-complaint. Sarah realized that she had no idea what was going to happen next, and that uncertainty, worse than anger, worse than confrontation, was going to be harder to live with. She went inside and made some dinner, something simple like pasta and sauce. She tried to read. She couldn't focus. At 7 p.m., there was a knock on the front door. Sarah opened it to find a woman she'd never seen before, older, maybe 70, with short gray hair and an expression of sharp intelligence. The woman's resemblance to Diane was striking. "Mrs. Milton," the woman said, "I'm Karen Chen, Diane's mother." "Oh," Sarah said. She wasn't sure how to proceed. "Would you like to come in?" They ended up in the living room, sitting on opposite ends of Sarah's couch, like two contestants on a reality show about to discuss their grievances. "I've been told about what happened at your pool this afternoon," Karen said. "I need to say up front that I think my daughter and her husband behaved inappropriately. I also need to say that I think you behaved inappropriately. These are not mutually exclusive statements." "I didn't attack anyone," Sarah said carefully. "I asked them to leave, and when they didn't seem inclined to listen, I made the environment uncomfortable enough that they would choose to leave." "You assaulted them with water." "I used a shower fixture on my own property to deter trespassers from my own property." Karen nodded slowly, as if Sarah had just confirmed something she suspected. "You're legally right. You morally clear. That's where it gets harder, isn't it?" "Is it?" Sarah felt a flash of anger. "Because I think morally I was entirely clear. They trespassed. They destroyed my property. They refused to acknowledge my requests for them to leave. What else was I supposed to do?" "I'm not here to argue that you were wrong," Karen said. "I'm here to tell you that Marcus is planning to press charges. He's consulted with a lawyer already. He's claiming assault. He's also claiming property damage, that you damaged the fence in some way as part of your attack. The fence fell because of the party, because of the people coming through it. That wasn't me." "I know, but Marcus's lawyer will argue that the fence was already compromised and that you deliberately didn't reinforce it or warn people about the danger. Or he'll argue that in your aggressive behavior with the shower, you pushed people into the fence and caused them to damage it further." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She hadn't thought about it that way. She'd been so focused on her right to her own property that she hadn't considered how the shower incident itself could be reframed, weaponized into something that made her the aggressor. "What do you want?" Sarah asked. "What I want," Karen said, "is for this to resolve without lawyers and without court. What I want is for you and Marcus to reach some kind of agreement about the fence, about the damages, and about moving forward as neighbors who can ignore each other but not actively hate each other." "He destroyed my fence without permission." "Yes, and he's prepared to pay to have it rebuilt. He's willing to cover the cost of the repairs, plus the cost of any other damages to your landscaping. He's also willing to go to whatever mediation or counseling situation you'd like to establish boundaries between the properties going forward." Sarah wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell Karen that she wasn't interested in settlements or compromises, that Marcus had violated her space and needed to face consequences for that violation. But she also understood what Karen was really saying. Get ahead of this now, or it's going to cost you far more in lawyers and stress and time. "How much is he offering?" Sarah asked. Karen named a figure. It was more than the planter, more than the damaged plants, more than the cost of repairs to the fence. It was, Sarah realized, roughly what it would cost to hire a lawyer to defend herself against assault charges that she hadn't committed, but that would still require her to prove she hadn't committed them. "And what does he want from me?" Sarah asked. "Silence," Karen said. "An agreement that you won't pursue this publicly. No social media, no bringing it to the HOA if there is one, no pressing charges of your own for the property damage or trespassing. So he gets to destroy my fence, ruin my day, invite strangers onto my property. And as long as I don't make a fuss about it, he pays for damages and we all move on. Essentially, yes. Sarah looked at Diane's mother, at this woman who had clearly been sent here to negotiate on behalf of a neighbor who was embarrassed and afraid of the social consequences of his own rudeness. "I'll take the money," Sarah said, "and I'll keep the silence, but only if he also acknowledges in writing that what he did was wrong and that it violated my property rights. I want to see those words in a document, even if no one else ever sees it." Karen smiled slightly. "I can probably make that happen." After Karen left, Sarah sat alone in her living room and felt the strange mixture of triumph and emptiness that comes from winning a battle you never wanted to fight. She'd be paid for the damages, the fence would be fixed, Marcus would be forced to acknowledge in writing that he had been wrong. But she had also assaulted him with water, by his definition and his lawyer's definition. She had also revealed herself to be the kind of person who would do that, which meant she was now in her own home waiting to be sued, waiting for charges to be pressed, waiting for everything to unravel in a way that was no longer in her control. The sun set. Sarah cleaned the pool filter system. She called the contractor who had originally installed the fence and got a quote for replacement. She processed the whole evening as though it were a data problem to be solved, organizing information, finding solutions, taking action. But underneath it all was the awareness that something fundamental had shifted. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back from it. Tomorrow, when she woke up, she would be the woman who had attacked a party with a shower. That would be the story. The legal papers arrived via certified mail, a lawsuit alleging assault, property damage, and emotional distress. Marcus Chen and Diane Chen, plaintiffs, versus Sarah Milton, defendant. The sum they were seeking was substantial enough that Sarah actually laughed when she saw the number, which then turned into something that felt closer to crying. She called Gerald immediately. "It's a bluff," he said after reading the complaint. "Mostly, they're hoping you'll settle quickly because you're scared." "I am scared. Which is why you called me and not agreed to anything. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to file a counterclaim for the fence damage and the property damage to your landscape. We're going to document that the fence destruction and the trespassing occurred before the shower incident, which means their property damage claim is fraudulent. They destroyed your fence, not the other way around. We're going to argue that you used reasonable force to remove trespassers from your own property, which is legal. And we're going to make it very clear that if they don't drop this, we're going to take it to trial and we're going to win, which means they're going to pay our legal fees on top of covering our damages." "Will we win?" Sarah asked. "Probably. These cases usually turn on one key question: were you in control of your own property? And the answer is yes, you were. They invaded it. You asked them to leave. They refused. You used non-harmful means to encourage them to leave. Water to the face is not assault, it's not battery, it's not injury, it's uncomfortable, it's humiliating for them, but it's legal." Sarah wanted to feel reassured. Instead, she felt the weight of legal fees and depositions and court dates settling over her like a heavy blanket. "There's something else," Gerald said. "I've had 3 calls from reporters. Apparently the story got out somehow, and it's becoming a thing on social media." "What story?" "A woman attacks a family reunion party with a hose. It's been framed as—" He paused, and Sarah could hear the grimace in his voice. "It's been framed as a pool party dispute. People are calling it a funny story, kind of a lighthearted example of neighborly conflict. But others are starting to take sides. Some people think what you did was justified. Some people think you were aggressive and unreasonable. It's becoming a discourse." Sarah got off the phone with Gerald and immediately made the mistake of checking her social media. The videos were everywhere. Apparently, someone at the party had taken a video of Sarah turning the shower on, and the footage had been edited in a way that made it look much more aggressive than it had felt. In the video, people were visible scattering in panic, and Sarah looked intense, almost rage-filled, standing there with the shower nozzle like she was wielding a weapon. The comments ranged from supportive to absolutely vicious. Finally, someone defending their property rights. "This is what should happen to trespassers. This woman is unhinged. She assaulted innocent people at a family reunion because she's angry about having a neighbor. The neighbors asked for permission. What did she think would happen? The neighbor didn't ask for permission from the woman who owns the property. He asked for permission from someone else's property. How is that not obvious? She's probably the worst kind of American. Selfish, property-obsessed, unable to compromise. Compromise with what? He destroyed her fence without permission. This is about respecting boundaries, not about being selfish. Sarah closed the app. She didn't need to read more. She knew exactly what was happening. Her life was being turned into content, and people who knew nothing about the situation were forming opinions about her character based on a 40-second video taken by someone at a party. By Friday, the local news had picked up the story. There was a segment on the evening news. Backyard dispute turns into pool party chaos. The anchor presented it as a lighthearted human interest story, but the actual reporting was deeply unfair to Sarah's position. The reporter had interviewed a handful of party guests who described their experience of being attacked with water and having their family reunion ruined. They didn't interview Sarah. They didn't talk to anyone who explained that Marcus had destroyed the fence without asking, that he'd invited strangers onto someone else's property, that Sarah had asked repeatedly and reasonably for everyone to leave before resorting to the shower. Instead, the framing was, "Woman has unusual reaction to neighborhood party." Sarah stopped going to work. She couldn't imagine sitting in her cubicle while her coworkers whispered about her, or worse, tried to be supportive in a way that acknowledged they'd seen the videos. She called in sick and then, when that wore thin, asked for emergency leave. Her company was compassionate in the way that large corporations with HR departments had been trained to be. They granted her 2 weeks. The implication was clear. Take a break, wait for this to blow over, come back when you're less radioactive. But blowing over required time, and in the interim, Sarah became very aware of how much of her identity was tied to her home. She couldn't use the pool. It felt like standing in a fishbowl, visible to anyone who wanted to peer through the fence. She couldn't sit on the patio comfortably because she'd be visible to the street. She started spending most of her time in the interior of the house, in spaces with curtains and doors. Michelle came over on Sunday with her kids. Sarah had been hesitant to let them come. She didn't want the children being associated with her, didn't want them catching whatever social contagion had attached itself to her name. But Michelle had insisted. "You can't live like a hermit," Michelle said while her children played video games in the living room. "You have to get past this." "I'm not sure I can," Sarah said. "Gerald says we'll probably win the lawsuit, but even if we do, I'm still the woman who attacked people with a shower. That's going to follow me. For a while, maybe, but people have short attention spans. Next week, something else will happen. Someone else will be in the news. This will fade." "Will it?" Michelle was quiet for a moment. "Probably not completely, but it will become less relevant. It will stop being something people actively discuss and become more of a fun anecdote that people occasionally mention. And eventually, it will be completely forgotten by everyone except you, and you'll be able to not think about it most days." Sarah wanted to believe her, but she also remembered what it felt like the day of the party, standing in her own backyard, watching someone destroy something she'd paid for and built carefully, and watching that person's complete indifference to that destruction. She remembered the moment when she decided that conventional approaches weren't going to work. She remembered the clarity of the decision to turn the shower on. If she could go back, would she do it differently? The question haunted her. Yes, she would have called the police sooner. Yes, she would have been more methodical about documentation. Yes, she would have hired Gerald immediately and followed his advice about not escalating. But would she choose not to turn the shower on? Would she choose to stand there, powerless, watching her space be invaded and destroyed while maintaining perfect composure? On that, she was less certain. On Monday morning, something shifted slightly. Sarah woke up to find that the story had been somewhat overtaken by national news. A celebrity had been arrested, a stock market event had occurred, a sports team had made a surprising trade. The local news cycle had moved on. The social media discourse was quieter. It was still there, the videos still existed, but it was no longer actively dominating the conversation. Sarah made coffee. She sat on her patio, carefully positioned so that she was visible to her yard but not to the street. The pool still needed work. The filter system had to run for several more days to get the water fully clear, but it was getting better. She called the fence contractor and confirmed a start date for the following week. The fence would be replaced with new wood, matching the original as closely as possible. It would be stronger and less prone to weather damage. It would also, Sarah realized, be a very visible reminder of what had happened, at least to her. Every time she looked at that fence, she would remember the party, the invasion, the decision to turn the shower on. That Friday, Corinne Chen came by again. This time she brought a check. "Marcus wanted me to give you this," Karen said. The check was for the amount they'd agreed on. "He also wanted me to give you this." Karen handed over an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Marcus himself, apparently. Sarah recognized his handwriting from notes he'd left with her before the divorce years ago. "Mrs. Milton, I owe you an apology. What I did on June 14th was wrong. I demolished your fence without asking permission. I allowed dozens of strangers onto your property without your consent. I refused to take responsibility when you asked me to manage the situation I created. These were serious violations of your property rights and your privacy. I understand why you responded the way you did. I don't apologize for you turning on the shower, but I need to acknowledge that you had the right to protect your property and your space. I failed in being a good neighbor. I've dropped the lawsuit. My lawyer advised against it, but I couldn't proceed with filing charges against you when I knew that I was the one at fault. I'm paying for all damages and repairs. I hope we can move forward as neighbors who maintain appropriate boundaries. Respectfully, Marcus Chen." Sarah read the letter 3 times. The handwriting wavered in places as though Marcus had struggled with what to write. But the words were clear, were direct, were exactly what she'd asked Karen for that night, an acknowledgement that what he'd done was wrong. "He came to his senses?" Sarah asked Karen. "He was always going to come to his senses," Karen said. "But it took a few days. Diane finally told him that she thought what he did was wrong, and hearing it from her made it real to him in a way that hearing it from you couldn't." After Karen left, Sarah called Gerald to confirm that the lawsuit had been officially dropped. It had been. The legal threat that had been hanging over her for almost a week was gone. 3 weeks after the party, Sarah went back to work. Her company had been understanding about the leave, and there was no awkwardness in the office, or at least not obvious awkwardness. Colleagues smiled at her. No one mentioned the videos. No one seemed to be holding the incident against her. But Sarah could feel something different in how they treated her. There was a slight distance, a careful politeness that suggested they were aware of what she'd done but were choosing not to acknowledge it. She was no longer just Sarah from data management. She was now Sarah who attacked that party, and everyone was being very professional about not discussing it. She tried to resume normal life. She finished the repair of the fence, and it looked exactly like what it was, new wood filling in where old wood had been destroyed. The visual metaphor was not subtle. She hired someone to landscape the area where plants had been trampled, and slowly the yard regained something like its original appearance. But the pool remained the thing she couldn't quite reclaim. She ran the filter system for days. She tested the water chemistry obsessively. She added chemicals and waited and tested again. Eventually, the water cleared. It returned to the sapphire blue that she loved. But when she got in it one afternoon in early July, it didn't feel like hers anymore. It felt like a space that had been violated and had never quite recovered its sanctity. She could see the full story in the water if she looked at it right. She could see the feet of 50 strangers all at once. She could see the confusion and anger. She could see herself standing at the edge with the shower nozzle, and she could see the way people scattered, the way her body language had shifted into something harder and less vulnerable than she normally allowed herself to be. It was maybe 3 weeks into August when Michelle sat across from her at Sarah's kitchen table and said, "I think you should talk to someone." "A therapist?" Sarah asked. "A therapist, yes, or a life coach, or someone. Because I think what happened with the party is less about the party and more about something deeper that the party exposed. Which is that you experienced a violation of your space, and instead of processing that violation, you responded to it. And now you're sitting here in your beautiful house with your beautiful pool, and you don't feel peaceful. You feel burdened. You feel like the violation won. You feel like what you did in response didn't actually solve the problem, it just created a different one." Sarah wanted to argue, but she couldn't. Michelle was right. The lawsuit was dropped. The fence was fixed. The landscaping was repaired. Everything was objectively back to how it had been. But subjectively, Sarah felt fractured in a way that she hadn't expected. She found a therapist, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, a woman in her 50s who specialized in trauma and boundary issues. The first session, Sarah told the whole story from the beginning. The invitation to the party that wasn't really an invitation, the fence falling down, the complete refusal of anyone to acknowledge that they were doing anything wrong, and finally, the decision to turn the shower on. Dr. Okonkwo listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, the therapist was quiet for a moment. "Do you think you did the right thing?" Dr. Okonkwo asked. "I think I did what I felt I had to do," Sarah said carefully. "That's not the same thing." "I know. What would have been the right thing?" Sarah thought about it. Probably calling the police immediately, probably hearing a lawyer before anyone even left the property, probably just removing myself from the situation and letting the system handle it. "And why didn't you do that?" "Because the system was slow. The officer said it would take 40 minutes to get there. By then, the party would have escalated. By then, more damage would have been done. So you decided to take the system into your own hands." "I did." "And what did that accomplish?" Sarah found herself getting angry. It got them to leave. It solved the immediate problem. "It did solve the immediate problem," Dr. Okonkwo agreed. "But what did it create?" "A lawsuit, social media attention, the sense that I'm the crazy neighbor." "And do you think that was worth the immediate solution?" "No," Sarah said and felt tears coming up. "No, I don't think it was worth it." Over the next several weeks, Sarah and Dr. Okonkwo worked through what the incident had actually been about. It wasn't really about the pool or the fence or the strangers in her backyard. It was about autonomy. It was about Sarah's deep, almost desperate need to be in control of her own space because her marriage had taken so much of her autonomy away. The divorce had been her reclaiming herself, and the pool had been her concrete manifestation of that reclamation. A thing entirely hers, controlled entirely by her, sacred in its privacy. When Marcus and his family had violated that space, they had triggered something profound. They had reminded Sarah of the feeling of being powerless in her own home, of having her boundaries disrespected, of having someone else make decisions about her life and her space without asking. The shower had been about reclaiming that control. It had been about being powerful, being aggressive, being the kind of person who couldn't be trespassed against because she wouldn't tolerate it. But in doing that, Sarah realized she had also become the kind of person she didn't want to be. She had become aggressive and defensive and willing to harm others, even minimally, to assert her power. She had become exactly what she had worked so hard not to become during her divorce. "The question," Dr. Okonkwo said in one session, "is not whether you were justified in doing what you did. You were justified. But the question is whether you want to be the kind of person who does those things, even when justified." And Sarah realized that she didn't. She didn't want to be that person. She wanted to be someone who could maintain boundaries without becoming defensive. She wanted to be someone who could acknowledge her anger without acting on it immediately. She wanted to be strong without being aggressive. That realization didn't solve the social media problem or make people forget about the incident, but it shifted something inside her. It gave her a way to think about what had happened that wasn't just about right and wrong, but about who she wanted to be. By September, Sarah had made some decisions. First, she was going to apologize to Marcus. Not because she thought she had been wrong. The property violation and fence destruction had been real. The trespassing had been real. But because she'd responded in a way that, while justified, had escalated the situation unnecessarily. She wrote him a letter, similar in tone to the one he'd written her. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. I was right to ask you and your guests to leave my property. I was right to be angry about the fence and the trespassing. But I was not right to respond with aggression, even the relatively harmless aggression of the shower. I escalated a situation that could have been resolved through calling the police and waiting for them to arrive. I know you've also come to regret your actions, and I appreciate that. I also want you to know that I regret mine, not in terms of boundary setting, but in terms of method. I could have protected my space without becoming a person who attacks others, even with water. I hope you'll accept this apology as sincerely as I accepted yours. Sarah." She had Karen deliver it, and 2 days later Marcus called. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know I didn't have to," Sarah replied, "but I wanted to." They talked for about 15 minutes. It was awkward and stilted, but it was also real in a way that the initial conflict hadn't been. They weren't going to become friends, but they could be neighbors who understood that they'd both made mistakes and that those mistakes didn't define them permanently. The second decision was more significant. Sarah was going to drain the pool. Not completely, she wasn't going to destroy it or waste it, but she was going to stop using it as her primary source of peace and validation. She was going to acknowledge that the pool had become a symbol rather than a resource, and symbols could be poisoned more easily than anyone expected. When she told Michelle, her sister was confused. "But you spent so much time and money on that pool." "I know I did," Sarah said. "And that's exactly the problem. I let the pool become my home instead of letting my home be my home. I tied my emotional well-being to a body of water, and when someone violated that space, I felt like my entire self had been violated." "So you're going to get rid of it?" "Not completely. I'm going to have the contractor close it down, drain it, and convert the space into a garden. I'm going to plant trees and flowers and create a space that's beautiful but that doesn't require constant vigilance and maintenance. I'm going to reclaim the space from being something I consume to being something I just exist in." The pool closure took place over the course of 2 weeks in October. The contractor drained the sapphire water, and Sarah watched it disappear, watched the space transform from something she'd invested so much in to just an empty concrete basin. For a moment, she felt a flutter of panic and regret. Then the feeling passed. Within a month, the basin had been filled with rich soil. Within 2 months, trees had been planted, shade trees that would eventually grow tall enough to create pockets of privacy throughout her backyard. Flower beds were established. A small stone seating area was created, somewhere to sit without the need to swim or perform or maintain. When Michelle first came to see the new space, she walked through it slowly, taking in the changes. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "It's really beautiful, but are you sad about the pool?" "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "But it's a different kind of sadness. It's the sadness of letting something go, not the sadness of something being taken from me." By November, the story of the pool party had almost completely faded from social media. There was a reference to it in a local newspaper article about neighborly disputes, but it was just a passing mention. Most of the original videos had stopped being shared. The discourse had moved on. But Sarah found herself thinking about the incident more, not less, as time passed and the acute social attention faded. She thought about it because it had revealed something important about herself, a capacity for anger and aggression that she hadn't fully acknowledged before, a willingness to hurt others, even minimally, if it meant reasserting her control. She thought about Marcus, too. She thought about how he had probably experienced similar patterns, assuming the world would accommodate his needs, not considering the impact of his actions on others, being shocked when there were consequences. They were neighbors still. Sometimes they waved at each other in the driveway. The fence between them was solid and new and would probably last another 30 years. But it was also a boundary now, consciously marked and respected in a way it hadn't been before. The backyard that had once been Sarah's sanctuary had become something more complicated, a space where she'd learned something true about herself, where she'd made a mistake, and then had to sit with that mistake long enough to understand it. By the time winter arrived, Sarah had stopped thinking about the party as something that had happened to her and started thinking about it as something that she had done. The shift was subtle but important. It meant she could take responsibility for her actions without denying that Marcus had violated her space. It meant she could be both right and wrong simultaneously. January came cold and clear. Sarah stood at the edge of her new garden watching the winter light slant across the space where the pool had been. The trees were still small, will take years to reach full height, but they were growing. The garden beds were dormant for the season, waiting for spring. The stone seating area had become her favorite spot for morning coffee, sheltered enough by the structure of the landscaping that it felt private, but open enough that she didn't feel trapped. Dr. Okonkwo had reduced their sessions to once a month. Sarah no longer needed to process what had happened so much as she needed to maintain the clarity she'd achieved about how to move forward. The therapist's final words in their most recent session had been simple. "You turned a violation into a learning. That's the best outcome possible." Sarah wasn't sure she'd call what had happened a learning so much as a reckoning, but the distinction was probably semantic. The lawsuit had been fully dropped and settled in November. The fence had become one of the most professionally maintained boundaries in the neighborhood, if only because both Sarah and Marcus were hyper-aware of its existence. Sarah had heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Marcus and Diane had separated, not because of the pool party incident, but because the incident had revealed some deeper incompatibilities in how they approached decisions and responsibility. Their marriage had already been strained, apparently. The party had just forced them to confront issues they'd been avoiding. Sarah didn't take satisfaction in that knowledge. She took a kind of sad recognition that violations and transgressions rippled outward in ways that were often invisible to the person who caused them. It was a Saturday in mid-January when there was a knock on her door. Sarah opened it to find Marcus himself, holding a coffee and looking uncomfortable. "Hi," he said. "I know this might be weird, but I was hoping we could talk for a minute." They ended up sitting in Sarah's new garden, which was perhaps ironic given the context. Marcus held his coffee like he wasn't quite sure what to do with it, and he didn't meet Sarah's eye for the first few minutes of their conversation. "I wanted to tell you that I've started seeing someone," Marcus said finally. "A therapist, and I've been trying to understand why I made the decisions I made that day." "And what have you figured out?" Sarah asked. "That I wasn't thinking about you at all," Marcus said. "That's the thing that's been eating at me. When I decided to demolish the fence and let people into your yard, I wasn't thinking about the fact that you wouldn't want that. I wasn't thinking about the fact that I should ask. I was just thinking about my own situation. My family was visiting, my niece was organizing this party, and I wanted to be the helpful neighbor who solved the logistics problem. I didn't think about the cost to you at all." "And that bothers you?" Sarah said. "It bothers me a lot, because I'm the kind of person who prides himself on being considerate, and I wasn't considerate at all. I was thoughtless." Sarah sipped her coffee. "For what it's worth, I think what I did in response was thoughtless too. I could have handled it differently, more calmly, more legally." "But I started it," Marcus said. "You did, but that doesn't mean I had to respond the way I did." They sat in silence for a while. The winter morning was cold enough that their breath was visible, small clouds of warmth dissipating into the cold air. "Diane and I are getting a divorce," Marcus said eventually. "Did you hear?" "I heard something like that. I think the pool party thing just forced us to confront the fact that we weren't working anymore. But it's not your fault. It's not because of what you did. It's because we were already broken. The pool party just made us see it." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and meant it. "Don't be. It probably needed to happen. I just wanted to tell you that you're not responsible for my life falling apart. I wanted you to know that I don't blame you." After Marcus left, Sarah sat alone in her garden for a long time. She thought about the chain of consequences that had started that day in June, how a decision he'd made had caused her to respond in a way that had led to legal complications, social media attention, personal reckoning. How his actions had indirectly contributed to the ending of his marriage, or at least had been the catalyst that forced acknowledgement of something already wrong. The word that kept coming to her was ripple. Not tsunami or earthquake or any of the dramatic language that implied violence. Just ripple. The way a single action spreads outward in waves that eventually touch everything, in ways that aren't always immediately visible. She had learned through this whole experience that action and consequence were not simple equations. You couldn't violate someone's space and expect the only impact to be to that one person. You couldn't respond to that violation with aggression and expect the impact to be only to the person you directed the aggression at. Everything connected to everything else. By spring, the garden had truly come alive. The trees were leafing out in that brilliant, hopeful green of early growth. The flowers were blooming in waves, tulips first, then hyacinths, then roses. Sarah had hired a landscaper to maintain it because she'd learned something important about herself. She wasn't actually that interested in gardening. She was interested in beauty, but only if she didn't have to obsess about maintaining it. The pool area had become her favorite spot for almost everything. She read there, had friends over for coffee there, sat there in the evenings and watched the light change. It was a space that she inhabited rather than a space that inhabited her. She had also done something that she couldn't quite explain to Michelle when asked. She had arranged to have the ceramic planter she'd loved, the one that had been broken during the party, professionally repaired and remounted in the garden. The repairs were visible. The planter showed the lines of its damage clearly. But it was no longer broken. It was broken and healed, which was somehow more beautiful than it would have been if it had never been damaged at all. Sarah had gone back to work fully in January and had found that the social weirdness of the post-party period had largely dissipated. People had moved on. She was just Sarah again, the woman in data management, not the woman who had attacked a party with a shower. The incident had been big enough in the moment to seem like it would define her, but it had been small enough in the context of everyone else's lives that it had faded into irrelevance quickly. That realization had been both comforting and sobering. It meant that her most dramatic moment, the thing that had felt like the biggest event of her life, had been barely a footnote in other people's experience. It had also meant that the other people's judgments of her, which had felt so damaging at the time, had mattered far less than she'd thought. By May, Sarah had become friendly enough with her neighbor 2 houses down, not Marcus, but the people on her other side, that she invited them over for a garden party. Not a pool party, a garden party. People came, they sat in the shade of the now flourishing trees, they drank wine and talked and laughed. It was small and intimate and entirely on Sarah's terms. At one point during the party, Marcus came by. He'd been invited, though Sarah hadn't expected him to come. He stood at the edge of the garden for a moment, taking it in before approaching. "It's beautiful," he said, "what you've done here." "Thank you," Sarah said. "I'm really sorry again about—" "I know you are," Sarah interrupted gently. "And I'm sorry too. We've both apologized. We both understand what happened. I think it's okay to just move forward now." Marcus nodded, relieved at being released from the responsibility of continued apology. Later, after most people had left and Sarah was cleaning up, Michelle came back inside from the garden and found Sarah sitting in the kitchen with a glass of wine. "That was nice," Michelle said. "It was," Sarah agreed. "And you're okay?" Sarah considered the question seriously. Was she okay? Had she recovered from the violation and the response and the subsequent social chaos? Had she processed everything enough that she was genuinely moving forward and not just performing recovery? "I think I am," she said finally. "I mean, I still think about that day, I probably always will, but I'm not sad about it anymore. I'm not angry at Marcus. I'm not ashamed of myself exactly, but I'm aware that I made a choice I wouldn't make again, and I think that's okay. I think that's actually healthy." "What did you learn?" Michelle asked. "That boundaries and aggression aren't the same thing. That you can protect your space without becoming someone you don't recognize. That violations ripple outward in ways you can't predict or control. That other people are usually not thinking about the impact of their actions on you. They're just thinking about their own situation. That the stories people tell about you don't have to be the stories you believe about yourself." "That's a lot of learning," Michelle said. "It was a lot of incident," Sarah replied. By summer, a year after the party, Sarah was genuinely happy. Not the kind of happiness that required everything to be perfect or that depended on other people respecting her boundaries. That kind of happiness was too fragile. But the kind of happiness that comes from knowing yourself, from understanding your own capacity for both good and harm, and from choosing, deliberately, to try to do better. The garden was at the height of its beauty. The trees provided shade and privacy without cutting her off entirely from the world. The flowers bloomed in succession, ensuring something was always new and fresh to look at. It was a space that gave her something rather than demanding things from her. And one warm evening in late June, exactly 1 year after the pool party, Sarah sat in her favorite spot in the garden with a book and a glass of wine and realized that she had genuinely forgotten about the incident. Not forgotten that it had happened, but forgotten to think about it. It had become something that had happened to her in the past, not something that was still happening to her now. A car pulled into the driveway next door at the Chen house. Sarah glanced over, curious. It was Marcus, returning from somewhere. He parked and got out, and for a moment they made eye contact across the solid fence that now separated them. He waved. She waved back. And then he went inside, and Sarah went back to her book, and the evening continued, quiet and peaceful and entirely hers. The water in the backyard where the pool had been was gone now, replaced by earth and life and growth. And that, Sarah realized, was exactly as it should be. Sarah stood at the fence line on a cold December afternoon, watching the light fade early the way it did in winter. The garden was dormant again, but it had come full circle now. She'd watched it grow and flourish and fade, and she was no longer surprised by any of those cycles. She thought about that moment a year and a half ago when she'd stood in her kitchen, watching the coffee brew, not knowing that her morning was about to be violently disrupted. She thought about the moment she'd decided to turn on the shower, about the clarity she'd felt, and the complexity she'd discovered afterward. If she could go back and change it, would she? The question had lost its power. She didn't need to know the answer anymore. She had lived with the consequences of her choices, had learned from them, had become someone different because of them. That was enough. The sun slipped below the horizon, and Sarah's garden went dark. Inside her house, the lights came on warm, golden, inviting. She went inside, closed the door behind her, and left the past where it belonged. Behind her, the fence stood solid and new, a clear boundary between one life and another. And that, she thought, was exactly as it should be.